This happened about 10 years ago, and to this day, I still think about it every Christmas. I was 18 at the time, living with my mom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Our family wasn't big on the holidays after my parents' divorce, but my mom still insisted we go to a Christmas party hosted by her best friend Karen. Karen's house was in a nicer part of town, huge with lots of open spaces and fancy decorations. I didn't want to go at first, but my mom guilted me into it, and I figured I'd spend the night. Scrolling on my phone, sneaking spiked punch when the adults weren't looking. The party was just like every suburban Christmas gathering, parents drinking and laughing, their kids running wild through the house. I remember drifting between conversations, eating finger foods, and trying to avoid small talk. Eventually, I settled into a spot in the living room, scrolling through social media while the noise of the party hummed around me. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought he was one of Karen's guests, mid for average height, dressed in a black coat and slacks. What stood out was that he wasn't talking to anyone. He was standing near the fireplace holding an empty plastic cup, just watching. His eyes moved slowly over the room, studying people like he was looking for someone. I tried not to stare, but something about him unsettled me. He didn't have that easygoing, tipsy look most adults at the party, and he looked sharp, alert, and completely out of place. I glanced around to see if anyone else noticed him, but nobody seemed to, so I brushed it off as just one of Karen's weirder friends. About half an hour later, I was in the kitchen grabbing a soda when I noticed him again. This time he was standing just outside the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The party was loud, but it was quiet outside, and he was silhouetted by the snow falling behind him. I felt my stomach drop. Why was he out there? He wasn't smoking and he wasn't talking to anyone. He was just standing in the snow, staring back into the house. I swear it felt like he was looking right at me. I quickly walked back into the living room, telling myself I was being paranoid. I even looked around for Karen to ask who he was, but I didn't see her. I tried to distract myself, chatting with some other teens near the staircase. That's when one of the younger kids, probably 6 or 7, came barreling down the stairs, laughing and shrieking in that way kids do when they're playing hide and seek. He dashed past us and then stopped short in the hallway. "Hey," the kid said, pointing. "Who are you?" I turned to see what he was talking about, and there he was again. The man was standing halfway up the staircase, staring down at us. I froze. His expression was completely blank. He didn't seem embarrassed or surprised to have been spotted. He just stood there, his hand resting lightly on the banister. The kid frowned, clearly unsettled too. "You're not supposed to be here," he said loudly. At this point, one of the older teens noticed and laughed nervously. "Dude, what are you doing upstairs? That's off limits." The man didn't say anything. He tilted his head slightly as though considering something, that then turned and disappeared back up the stairs. Everyone went quiet for a second, and I felt a chill go down my spine. "Who is that guy?" I whispered. "Maybe he's Karen's brother or something," someone suggested. I wasn't so sure. Karen didn't have any siblings, at least none I'd ever heard of. I decided I'd had enough of the weirdness and went to find my mom. I found her in the dining room chatting with Karen, who was refilling glasses of wine. I waited until I had her attention, then whispered, "Hey Mom, there's some creepy guy here. He was upstairs." Karen overheard me and frowned. "What guy?" I described him. "The black coat, the blank stare, the way he'd been standing on the stairs." Karen's face went pale. "There shouldn't be anyone upstairs. We only invited family and close friends." My mom tried to brush it off, saying maybe it was someone's husband or a plus one, but Karen shook her head. "I know everyone who's here tonight. No one fits that description." That's when Karen's husband Dan overheard us and got involved. "What's going on?" Karen quickly filled him in, and Dan didn't hesitate. "I'll check it out." He went up the stairs with a couple of other guys, leaving the rest of us waiting nervously at the bottom. Minutes passed, and I could hear doors opening and closing upstairs. Finally, Dan came back down looking irritated. "No one's up there," he said. "We checked Every room. Are you sure? I pressed, because I saw, and Dan shot me an annoyed look, clearly thinking I was imagining things. No one's up there, kid. Probably just some friend of a friend who wandered where he shouldn't. I wanted to argue, but my mom gave me a look that said drop it, so I did. For a while, everything seemed normal again. The party continued, and people started laughing and drinking like nothing happened. I tried to convince myself Dan was right. Maybe it really was someone's clueless plus one. Then about an hour later, one of the parents realized their little boy Ryan was missing. Panic set in. Immediately the party screeched to a halt as everyone started searching for Ryan. We checked every room, every closet, even the backyard, but he was gone. Karen was on the verge of tears, and someone finally called the police. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes later when Ryan was found. He was in the basement. The door to the basement had been locked all night. Karen and Dan never used it, but someone had pried it open. Ryan was sitting at the bottom of the steps crying. When they asked him what happened, he kept saying, "The man told me to wait down here." "What man?" Karen asked, frantic. Ryan sniffled and replied, "The man in the black coat. He said he needed to find his family." My blood ran cold. The police arrived not long after. They searched the house and found the basement window open with footprints leading out into the snow. The cops said it was probably a drifter who'd snuck in, maybe hoping to steal something. But the weirdest part, nothing was missing. All I know was that Ryan was lucky. We all were, because whoever that man was, he had been inside the house for hours, blending in just enough to go unnoticed, watching us. To this day, I get sick to my stomach when I think about what could have happened if Ryan hadn't been found in time. This happened about 5 years ago when I was 22, and it's by far the scariest experience of my life. I was home from college for Christmas break, staying with my parents in the small Midwest town where I grew up. My parents live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where people leave their doors unlocked during the day, and everyone knows each other's names. It felt safe, peaceful. I think that's why what happened caught me so off guard. My parents were hosting their annual Christmas party that night. A tradition they've had for as long as I can remember. It was always the same friends and family crammed into the house, Christmas music playing on a loop, way too much food, and lots of wine. The party would spill out into the front yard and even the sidewalk when it got too crowded inside. I wasn't feeling very social that year. I'd just gone through a rough breakup, and honestly, I was planning to keep to myself upstairs for most of the night, but my mom guilt tripped me into coming down to help greet guests. It was around 7:00 p.m. when the party was in full swing. I was standing near the entryway sipping on some spiked cider and trying not to make awkward small talk. That's when I noticed him. A man in a Santa suit was standing in the front yard just beyond the glow of the Christmas lights. At first I thought he might be part of the party. Maybe my mom had hired someone to surprise the kids with gifts or something. She always went overboard with the Christmas cheer. But as I watched him, I realized he wasn't interacting with anyone. He was just standing there still as a statue, looking toward the house. I nudged my mom, who was busy chatting with one of the neighbors. "Hey, did you hire a Santa?" I asked. She frowned. "No." Why? I motioned toward the yard, but when I looked back, he was gone. "Hun, never mind, I guess," I muttered, feeling a little uneasy. The rest of the night went on like normal, laughing, drinking, people swapping stories about the year. I tried to forget about the weird Santa guy and even started to relax a little. Around 9:30, I went outside for some fresh air. Most of the party had shifted to the back patio, so the front yard was empty. I was standing on the porch enjoying the silence when I noticed footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. The tracks LED from the sidewalk up to the front of the house, stopping right under the living room window. I felt a shiver. That had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had been standing there watching the party through the window. I looked around, but Didn't see anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went back inside and locked the front door, something my parents rarely bothered to do. The party started to wind down around midnight, and most of the guests had left by then. My parents were tipsy and laughing as they cleaned up the kitchen while I wandered upstairs to my old room. I figured I'd watch some Netflix until I fell asleep. About an hour later, I was half asleep when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind. It had been snowing steadily all night, and sometimes the trees near my window would creak when the wind picked up. But then I heard it again, something heavier, like footsteps crunching in the snow. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps were deliberate, moving slowly toward the house. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the window, trying to keep myself calm. When I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, my heart nearly stopped. It was him, the man in the Santa suit was standing in the front yard again, staring up at my window. He wasn't moving, just standing there in the same spot as before, his red suit and white beard almost glowing in the dim light from the street lamps. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. I didn't want to wake my parents. I figured they'd brush it off as someone pulling a prank, but I knew something wasn't right. I texted my best friend. Instead, there's a guy in a Santa suit standing in my front yard. He's been here twice tonight. What do I do? She told me to call the cops as soon as possible. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing, but when I glanced back out the window, the man was closer. He was standing at the edge of the porch, his head tilted slightly like he was trying to see inside. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could, trying to keep my voice steady. She told me to stay on the line while she sent an officer to check it out. Is he still there? She asked. I peeked through the curtain again. He was gone. I don't see him anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She told me to stay inside, lock all the doors and windows, and wait for the police. About 15 minutes later, I saw the flashing red and blue lights outside. 2 officers knocked on the door, and I let them in, explaining everything that had happened. They searched the yard and the surrounding streets, but didn't find anyone. They assured me it was probably just a prankster, maybe someone from the party trying to mess with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. After the cops left, I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining that red suit standing in the snow, those dark eyes staring up at my window around 3 a.m. I finally drifted off. The next morning, I woke up to my mom calling my name from downstairs. You've got to see this, she said, her voice shaky. I came down to find her standing in the living room staring at the front door. My stomach dropped when I saw what she was pointing at. The doorknob was scratched, deep gouges in the brass like someone had been trying to force it open. My dad opened the door, and we all froze. There were more footprints in the snow leading up to the porch. This time they didn't stop at the window. They circled the house, pausing at every door and window like someone had been checking for a way inside. I called the police again, and they came back to take another look. The officer who showed up was older, rough, and clearly didn't think much of it. He said it was probably just a drunk partygoer who got confused. But then I told him about the Santa suit. His expression changed. He asked me to describe the man in detail, his height, his build, the way he'd been standing in the yard. I told him everything I could remember, and when I was done, he nodded grimly. We've had a few reports like this recently. He said a man dressed as Santa has been spotted around town watching people through their windows. We've been trying to catch him, but he always disappears before we get there. I felt sick. The officer said he'd have patrol cars circle the neighborhood for the next few nights, but there wasn't much else they could do unless he came back. He never did to this day. I have no idea who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he really was just a creepy prankster, or maybe it was something much worse. All I know is that I still get chills every time I see a Santa suit.